I'm Maya Voss, 39 years old, and I spent 17 years in the Marine Corps building one of the most demanding military working dog training programs in the country. For most of that time, my father, a retired Army infantryman who believed that real soldiering meant carrying a rifle in the field, looked at my career and saw something he couldn't quite place on his map of what mattered. I gave it everything I had anyway. But when a Marine staff sergeant snapped at me in an airport security line, and his dog broke 3 years of protocol to press his nose into my palm, something changed that I hadn't seen coming. Have you ever done the most important work of your life for someone who didn't know how to see it? If so, I'd love to hear your story in the comments. Before I get into what happened, let me know where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to keep building something when the most important person in your life couldn't find the words to say it mattered, hit that like button and subscribe. My father used to say that the measure of a soldier was what he was willing to carry. He meant weight, the physical kind, the rucksack and the rifle and the miles of open field in the dark. He had carried those things for 20 years as an Army infantryman, and he believed in them the way some people believe in Scripture, not as a conclusion he had arrived at through analysis, but as a bedrock assumption that preceded every other thought. They were the real proof of a real thing. Everything else was auxiliary. Support roles, coordination work, the vast administrative infrastructure that kept the machine operational. Important, he'd grant you that. Important, but not the thing itself, not the measure of whether a person had truly been tested. I understood what he meant. I spent a very long time not understanding why he thought it was the whole answer. I grew up in Fredericksburg, Virginia, in a house with framed unit photographs on the dining room walls and a man at the head of the table who measured everything against his own particular standard. James Voss, Dad, had enlisted in the United States Army in 1981, straight out of high school in rural Tennessee, and he had spent 20 years as an infantryman before retiring as a sergeant first class and moving us to Virginia to be close to his old unit brothers. He settled into civilian life the way some veterans do, visibly with the military still organized around him like furniture he had decided not to rearrange. He had strong opinions about how things ought to be done. He had even stronger opinions about which things were worth doing at all. He was not a difficult man the way some difficult men are difficult. He didn't shout or break things or make the house feel dangerous at night. He simply had a clear and settled sense of what mattered, and everything outside that circle existed in a kind of dim periphery he never quite turned toward. The dimness wasn't malicious. It was just where things went when they didn't fit his framework. Not discarded, just deprioritized, the way you fold a map back to the section you're actually navigating and leave the rest flat and unread. I was 8 years old the first time I understood this, fully enough to feel it. He was telling a story at dinner about a patrol in the Gulf, the kind of story he told well, with rhythm and weight, and a moment at the end where the room went either quiet or loose, depending on what the story required. My brother Danny was 5 and barely listening. My mother Linda was laughing in all the right places, the way she had learned to laugh at the right places over 23 years of marriage. I was listening with my whole body, the way children listen to the things they have already decided are important. When he finished, I asked if I could be a soldier too when I grew up. He looked at me and patted my head and said, "Girls don't carry rifles, Bug. Not unkind." A fact, the way he delivered most things that had already been settled in his mind. I didn't argue. I was 8. I filed it away. The thing about being filed away is that the filing doesn't end the question. It just puts it somewhere dark and quiet, where it grows on its own, without sunlight, until it becomes something you trip over in the middle of an ordinary day. I spent my entire childhood tripping over that question. I watched my father in the company of veterans, men he had served with, the occasional retired officer who came through Fredericksburg for a reunion, and I watched how he changed in those rooms, how he became slightly taller, more careful with his words, more illuminated from within, the way a lamp responds to more current running through it. He was not a small man in daily life, but in the company of people he considered peers and superiors, he became something larger than the version who sat at the dinner table and talked about the weather and his old unit and the ways the world had gone soft since his generation had been responsible for it. I decided early that I wanted to be the kind of person who made my father stand like that. I thought I understood how to get there. I thought the answer was proximity to the thing he respected. I didn't yet understand that the thing he respected was a category I was not allowed to enter on his terms, no matter how close I got. By the time I was 16, I had concluded that what I wanted was an officer's commission, and the commission would come from a military college. That summer, a retired Army colonel came through the neighborhood for a reunion. An old friend of my father's, a man who had gone further than James had gone and carried himself with the particular ease that comes from knowing exactly what you are and having earned the right to wear it without effort. I watched this man work the crowd at my parents' backyard barbecue. I watched the room organize itself around him, not through charm, not through dominance, but through a kind of settled certainty that made other people want to orient toward him. And I watched my father, who did not organize himself around anyone, nod carefully at everything this colonel said. My father, who had opinions about everything, who challenged everything, who redirected every conversation back to his own axis. My father nodded carefully. I was 16 years old, and I thought, that is what I want, not the status of it. Not even the recognition. I wanted the quality of certainty. The kind of certainty that is earned and permanent and lives in the bones so that it doesn't require announcement. I thought getting close enough to the military would give it to me. It took me many more years to understand that it was already there, and that the only one I was waiting for permission from was the wrong person. I applied to Virginia Military Institute in the fall of 2003. My father objected, not angrily. He rarely did anything angrily, but with the settled certainty that functioned as its own particular kind of wall. He thought I should go to a regular university. He suggested nursing, which he meant kindly, I believe, because he associated it with a stable and respectable life for a woman, and those were things he genuinely wanted for me. He was not trying to diminish me. He simply could not conceive of the space I was trying to occupy, and in the absence of a framework for it, he offered the nearest framework he had. I applied to VMI anyway, with my mother's quiet and careful help. She drove me to orientation and didn't tell my father until the night before. He didn't come to orientation. I had already stopped expecting him for the things I'd decided without him. I was the first place in my life where I found out what I was made of when no one who knew me was watching. The rat year. The deliberately brutal, physically and psychologically demanding first year the school puts every new cadet through was the best thing that happened to me in my first 22 years of life. And I say that with full awareness of how it would sound to someone who has not done it. It was cold. It was exhausting. It was constructed to break the parts of you that needed breaking and to find out what remained when everything else had been stripped away. What remained in me was something I genuinely hadn't known was there. A quality of calm under extended pressure, a willingness to stay inside difficulty without reaching for an exit, and a nearly complete indifference to the opinions of people who were trying to use those opinions to make me smaller than I was. That last one turned out to be the most useful thing VMI gave me. I am still using it. I graduated in May of 2008 in the top 15% of my class and received my commission as a second lieutenant in the United States Marine Corps. My mother cried from the audience, not from surprise, just from the fullness of the moment. The way she cried at weddings and baptisms and anything that marked the completion of something that had required a long effort. Danny took photographs. My father sat in the row of family members and clapped when everyone else clapped. Afterward, at dinner, he told the table about his own enlistment in 1981. The recruiter's office in Knoxville, Tennessee, the bus to basic. His first week in the barracks with men from parts of the country he had only seen on maps. He told it with the rhythm and precision he always brought to those stories, and the table listened, and I sat across from him in my dress uniform with the new gold bar on my collar and watched him redirect. It was not calculated or deliberate. It was simply his natural gravity, the way he moved through rooms and conversations, always finding his own center and letting everything else move around it. I ordered the salmon. I watched him. And when I drove home alone that night and sat at a red light and looked at my gold bar in the rearview mirror, I made a quiet decision. I did not need him to understand yet. I would give him time. I was 22 and I believed, with the full confidence of someone who has not yet had that confidence seriously tested, that time was the variable I had the most of. The early years move the way careers do when the work is good and the standards are clear. Forward, with occasional friction, building towards something that gradually begins to resemble a life. I completed the basic school at Quantico in 2009 and was assigned to Camp Lejeune. My fitness reports were strong from the first cycle. My commanding officer noted my attention to logistics, my capacity to read personnel dynamics quickly, and the particular quality of calm I seemed to carry into situations that were trying to become something more disorganized. I wrote letters home every few weeks, real letters, handwritten, the way I had been raised to communicate. And my father called on a schedule that started weekly and gradually became monthly and then occasionally. He always asked the same question, whether I had met any good men out there. He meant it affectionately. He was offering me the version of care he had available. I answered the same way every time, something neutral that wasn't quite a yes and wasn't quite a no. We were fluent in that particular exchange. I deployed to Afghanistan in 2010. I was 24 years old, attached to an infantry element at a forward operating base in the eastern provinces, working in a coordination and assets management capacity that required exactly the qualities my CO at Lejeune had identified: the ability to read competing needs and stay functional when the complexity became noise. I was good at it. I found genuine satisfaction in the work, not the performed satisfaction of someone doing what they're supposed to be doing, but the actual kind, the kind that doesn't need external confirmation, because the quality of the outcome is its own evidence. I came home in 2011 with a commendation and the beginning of an understanding about what I wanted to do next, though I didn't have the precise language for it yet. The language came from a dog. I had been back at the forward operating base for 3 weeks when a patrol was staged to clear a structure that reconnaissance had flagged as potentially occupied by hostile personnel. 3 men stood at the door and assessed and decided they needed more information before entering. Then the handler brought up his Belgian Malinois. His name was Hector, 4 years old, working his second deployment. And Hector went into that building the way water enters a space. Quick and complete and without argument. 60 seconds. The indication came back. Unoccupied. 3 men who had been standing in the heat, second-guessing each other, moved through the door because a dog had told them it was safe. I stood on the perimeter watching even after the all clear, long after any operational reason to keep watching. There was something in the partnership. The quality of communication between the handler and the dog, the way the animal worked with a confidence that was not arrogance, but simply pure and earned competence, that moved something in me that briefings and commendations and fitness reports had never moved. It felt like recognition, like looking at a thing and understanding, without needing anyone to explain it, that this is what you have been looking for. I came home and read everything available on military working dog programs. I attended demonstrations at Quantico. I spoke to handlers, to trainers, to veterinarians who worked the program at Lackland. And then I made a decision I understood, even as I made it, would not land the way I needed it to land. I enrolled in the military working dog handler course at Lackland Air Force Base in the spring of 2012 and called home to tell my parents. My mother said it sounded exciting. My father paused. The kind of pause that means the answer is already formed and he is deciding how much of it to deliver. And said, "So you're going to be a dog handler?" I said the program was specialized and the dogs were central to a wide range of critical operations. He said, "I know what it is, Maya. I've just always thought it was a shame when a person with decent scores ends up walking an animal." I said, "The dogs save lives, Dad." He said, "Sure. But so do medics. I never saw a medic get a parade." I let that sit on the line between us for a moment. Then I said I'd talk to him soon and hung up, and I didn't call home for 2 weeks, which was 3 days longer than my usual interval, and he didn't notice. I was good at Lackland. Not through effort, but through fit, the way a key fits a lock that has been waiting for it. Something in the work connected to something in me at a level I hadn't accessed before. The patience it required, the quality of attention, the way a relationship built on consistency and honesty produced, over time, a kind of trust that was absolute and that could not be faked. I returned to Quantico in 2013 as an MWD handler and junior trainer, and within 2 years, I had built a reputation that my evaluators described in performance reports as uncommon. My washout rates were the lowest in the branch. The dogs I worked with finished their training with a quality of responsiveness that other trainers began deliberately studying. I was promoted to major in 2015, and my commanding officer wrote that I had transformed the approach to MWD certification at the battalion level. I did not send the evaluation to my father. I knew what he would do with it, something technically kind and actually tangential. And I had learned that silence, at least, contained the possibility of something unsaid, while the familiar response contained nothing I hadn't already received 100 times. By 2016, I had taken over as coordinator of the Marine Corps MWD training program, and and was spending my days building it from a small and inconsistently resourced operation into a structured command that processed 3 full certification cohorts per year. In 2019, I was promoted to lieutenant colonel and formally given command of the Marine Corps Military Working Dog Training Branch at Quantico. I was 33 years old. I commanded 22 dogs, 60 staff, and a program that had certified working dogs, now deployed across 3 active theaters. My father called to acknowledge the promotion with a brief warmth that retreated quickly into the weather. Then Danny's recent news, then a comfortable silence that passed for the end of a conversation. He mentioned that Danny had just bought a house in McLean. I said that was great news. He said, yes, it's a nice area. We hung up, and I sat at my desk for a moment before going back to work. That same year, a Belgian Malinois named Rex, military designation WD 7743, arrived at Quantico from the breeding program. He was 14 months old, too eager, not yet patient enough to understand that stillness was also a form of readiness. I took him on personally, not strategically. I simply watched him in the exercise yard on his second day and decided he needed someone whose particular frequency could match his. For the next 18 months, Rex and I worked together 5 days a week in all weather. Through the full range of the certification curriculum, detection, apprehension, tactical obedience, patrol. I also taught him something beyond the formal curriculum, which cannot be written into a training document, but which separates a very good working dog from an exceptional one. The ability to hold genuine attention inside complexity, to stay present under pressure without collapsing into anxiety or defaulting to aggression, to wait with full intention because the waiting is part of the work. By the time he completed his training in 2021, Rex was the highest-rated dog the branch had produced in 6 years. I paired him with Staff Sergeant Marcus Reyes in 2022. Reyes had a natural ease with animals that could not be taught, the kind of patience that a dog like Rex would need in a handler, and they deployed together 8 weeks after pairing. The one report I received in the first 6 months said, "Working well. That was enough." October of 2025. My family, my father James, 65, my mother Linda, 63, my brother Danny, 35, his wife Claire, and me, had agreed, through a negotiation conducted mostly through my mother over 3 months of phone calls, to take a vacation together. The first group trip since 2016. Danny and Claire were expecting their first child in the spring. My father had had a cardiac event over the summer. Minor, resolved quickly, but it had frightened Linda in a way that she had communicated to me in the careful language she used when she had made up her mind about something without quite saying what she had decided. She wanted her family in the same room before the year was out. We were flying to Florida on a Friday morning in October, out of Dulles International Airport, and my father had started his low-level commentary on the crowd before we cleared the departures hall. I was in jeans, a gray button-down, and sneakers. No uniform, no rank insignia, nothing to mark what I was or what I had spent 17 years building. Just a woman in her late 30s with a carry-on, and a family operating at its characteristic level of friction. The security checkpoint at Dulles on a Friday in October is busy in the way of a thing that is technically functioning, but only barely. Enough throughput to keep the line moving, not enough to keep anyone comfortable. My father was already providing running commentary on the people who had packed as though they were relocating permanently, and on the philosophical failure of commercial aviation to organize itself with the efficiency of a well-run motor pool. I had stopped responding to this commentary several airports ago. I was near the front of our group, pushing my bag toward the conveyor belt, when the woman directly ahead of me struggled with a bin for her shoes. An older woman, moving slowly, a little flustered by the machinery of it. I stopped and helped her sort it out. 10 seconds, 15 at most. But it backed up the space at the conveyor, and behind the conveyor, Staff Sergeant Marcus Reyes was working Rex through a routine checkpoint sweep with Rex on a short working leash, and he looked up from the dog's sweep pattern at the delay and found me at the center of it. He said, "Move it, lady. You're blocking the lane. Step to the side." His voice was flat and professional. Not cruel, not impatient in any personal sense. He was managing a working dog through a crowded security checkpoint, and I was creating an obstacle, and he said so, plainly, the way you say things when you are doing a job and someone is in the way. 2 rows back, my father heard it. His face broke into the first wide smile of the morning. The specific smile of a man who has found confirming evidence for something he already believed. The satisfied smile of a person whose map of the world has just been validated by the territory. He said, at a volume that the surrounding travelers could comfortably hear. Even the dog handlers telling you to get out of the way, Maya. Danny made a sound that was almost a laugh and then thought better of it. Claire looked at the floor. My mother said nothing, and her face stayed careful and neutral, the way it went when she had decided not to intervene. I stepped aside. I said nothing to Reyes and nothing to my father. I was 39 years old, and I had 17 years in the Marine Corps. And I commanded a branch that had certified working dogs, now guarding American lives across 3 active theaters. And my father was laughing at me in a public airport because a staff sergeant with a dog told me to move. And in the framework he had built and lived in for 65 years, that was simply the natural order of things, the way it shook out when a person spent her career doing work that didn't register on his particular scale. Then Rex stopped. He had been working his sweep pattern with the professional rhythm of a dog who has performed this task thousands of times. Nose down, systematic, unhurried. Then he stopped. His head came up. Not in the detection posture, not the focused, deliberate alert that means he has located a target. Something slower than that. Something I recognized even before I could name it. The specific way a dog's whole body changes when it encounters a scent that means something prior to anything it has been trained to find. Something that lives in a different layer of memory entirely. Rex's nose moved in the air above my hand where it rested at my side, and then his tail began a long, slow, steady sweep. And he pulled the leash hard toward me, not aggressively, nothing like aggression, but with the sudden and complete certainty of a creature that has made a decision and has no intention of reconsidering it. Before Reyes could correct him, Rex was pressing his muzzle into my palm and licking the back of my hand with his tail, moving in long, even strokes. Reyes said, "Rex! Rex! Heel! What are you? Rex! Heel!" Rex paid him no attention at all. In 3 years of active service, Rex had never failed to respond to a heel command. My right hand dropped to my thigh without my deciding to drop it. 2 fingers pressed flat against the fabric of my jeans. The hand signal I had used in training, the signal Rex had learned in his first 12 weeks at Quantico, from my hands specifically, the signal that meant sit and be still, and you have done exactly what was needed. Rex sat immediately and perfectly straight and looked up at me with the quality of attention he had always had. Steady, certain, wholly present. The quality that had made him the highest-rated dog the branch had produced in 6 years. Reyes stared at the dog. Then he looked at me. He took in my posture, my hands, the way Rex was sitting with the precision of a dog who has been returned to a trusted signal by someone who taught him that signal before anyone else did. Reyes went very still. He said, "Ma'am, how did you know that signal?" I looked at him. He was 29, 30 at most. He had the expression of a man recalculating something quickly. Not panicked, just working. He said slowly, You're Lieutenant Colonel Voss. You're from the training branch. You trained him." He looked at Rex, then at me. Then he released the leash, drew himself fully upright, and raised his right hand in a salute. He said, "Lieutenant Colonel Voss, ma'am, I apologize. I didn't know. Ma'am, I'm sorry," I said. "At ease, Staff Sergeant. He's a good dog. Take care of him." He said, "Yes, ma'am." He held the salute until I acknowledged it, and then lowered his hand and stood at ease with the particular composure of someone managing a difficult moment with professionalism. The travelers nearest the checkpoint had stopped to watch. Danny had gone completely silent. Claire had one hand near her mouth. My mother was very still, the way she went still when something had happened that she did not yet know how to respond to. My father had gone quiet in a way I had never seen from him. Not the comfortable quiet of a man at rest. Not the comfortable quiet of a man who has run out of things to say, but the specific and weighted quiet of a man who has just had the coordinates of something shift beneath him and has not yet worked out how to rebalance. I had never in my life seen my father look precisely like that. I picked up my carry-on and moved to the conveyor and did not look at him. We boarded the plane in a silence that was a different texture from the silences we usually carried. Whatever ease the vacation was supposed to have had was punctured, and what remained was not uncomfortable exactly, but weighted. The weight of something having been established that cannot be retrieved or redirected or laughed off. I sat at the window and looked at the tarmac and tried to identify what I was actually feeling. Not the salute. The salute was just a moment, a data point, an event. What stayed with me was the laugh. My father's wide, satisfied laugh at 7:40 in the morning, at the expense of 17 years. The laugh was simple and not complicated by cruelty. He had found something funny. That was almost the worst part. That it was not malicious, that it came from a man who loved his daughter and in the same instant could find it funny that a dog handler told her to move. Because in his framework, those two facts occupied entirely separate spaces that had never been asked to share a room. There had been a promotion dinner in 2014 where my elevation to major had been mentioned briefly and then absorbed into a longer conversation about Danny's then new job. There had been a change of command ceremony in 2019 that my parents attended and that my father spent in the back row talking to a retired lieutenant colonel about a shared theater of operations. There had been birthday cards with checks and no notes, holiday calls that ran to Danny's news, and then the weather, and then a silence that passed for the end of something. 20 years of small pivots, each minor on its own, accumulated into a shape I had been carrying without quite naming it. Rex had remembered me after 3 years. In the time it took to cross a security lane, without announcement, he had known me. Not because I had introduced myself, because 18 months of daily honest work had left something in him that 3 years of new assignments and new deployments could not overwrite. My father, who had been present for 39 years, still needed to be told what my program was called. At the connector airport, Danny appeared beside me at the coffee counter. He said, "Look, he was just, you know how he is." I said, "I know exactly how he is, Danny. That's the point." He said, "He thinks what you do is impressive. He just doesn't know how to say it." I said, "He's had 39 years. He could have worked it out before the airport." Danny was quiet. Then he said, "Just don't disappear on us, Maya," and went back to the gate. That evening at the hotel in Florida, I called Diane. Lieutenant Colonel Diane Okafor, 40 years old, 12 years of friendship. The person who requires the least explanation of anything I actually feel because she has seen enough of it unfold in real time to have the full context without editorial. She has met my father once, at a change of command ceremony, and watched him spend the afternoon talking to a retired Army lieutenant in the back row while I stood at the front. Afterwards, she said, "Some people are only built to see what they already respect." She had been right. I hadn't been ready to hear it then. She said, "Reyes actually saluted you at Dulles." I said, "Full attention, middle of the checkpoint." "Friday morning," she said. "And your dad?" I said, laughed first, then went quiet. She said, "Which was worse?" I thought about it honestly. I said, "The laugh." The quiet was just the laugh landing somewhere it couldn't be taken back from. She said, "Yeah," and she let it be exactly that, which is the thing about Diane. She doesn't offer alternative interpretations of things that don't need an alternative interpretation. She just heard it. That was what I needed. I walked the hotel beach that night alone, shoes in hand, the Gulf flat and dark to the horizon. I thought about Rex. Not the checkpoint, but the first week I had him. He had been too eager, wanting to work before he had the fundamentals, wanting to demonstrate before he had learned patience. I had spent that first week doing almost nothing except teaching him to be still. Just sit. Just wait. Understand that being still is not a failure of readiness, but a form of it. That a dog who cannot hold itself quiet inside distraction cannot be fully trusted. That the capacity to wait with full intention is one of the most demanding things you can ask a living creature to do. He had fought it the way all driven dogs fight it. He wanted to run, to work, to show, and I sat with him day after day in the exercise yard and waited until the wanting to show gave way to the understanding that showing was not the point, that the work was the point, that the work spoke for itself if you let it. I thought about that on the beach, and I thought about my father's laugh, and I thought, I have been fighting the stillness too. I have been sending milestone emails, making weekly calls, translating everything I do into a language I thought he might be able to hear, performing for a review I was never asked to submit to, instead of simply being still in the knowledge of what I was and letting the work speak and accepting, finally, that his ability to hear it was not the measure. The morning of the second day, James passed me the coffee carafe at the hotel breakfast table, quietly without making eye contact. He's not a man who makes offerings easily, and this one was small and offered without ceremony, easy to miss if you weren't paying attention to his grammar. I took the coffee. I said thank you. That was all that passed between us for 2 more days. Back at Quantico, I let 3 weeks go by before calling home. I usually called weekly. James phoned at the 4-week mark. We talked for 4 minutes, the weather, Danny's promotion at the firm, whether I sounded tired. I said I was fine. I hung up and didn't call back for another 3 weeks. My mother called separately to check in. We talked for 20 minutes and she didn't mention my father, and I didn't either. And somehow, that was its own kind of conversation. I also stopped sending the milestone emails. I had maintained this habit since my first deployment, sending my father updates when something significant happened in the branch. I told myself it was keeping him informed. What it actually was, if I looked at it honestly, was submitting myself year after year to a review I had never been invited to participate in, hoping that one more commendation or one more record broken would be the thing that finally made him turn toward me the way he turned toward the colonel at the barbecue. In November, the branch achieved its lowest washout rate on record, something I was genuinely proud of, the result of 3 years of structural work and careful personnel development. I opened my email, I typed the subject line, then I closed the window. Not from anger, not to punish him. I just finally asked the question I had been avoiding. What do I actually expect him to do with this? And the honest answer was exactly what he has always done. And that was enough of an answer to close the window and go back to work. Reyes sent a handwritten letter to my office that November. He thanked me for training Rex. He said Rex was the best dog he had ever worked, and that in the field he could tell someone had spent real time with him. Not just run him through a curriculum, but actually been present with him. He apologized again for the airport and said he had replayed the moment across the rest of his deployment, and it still made him wince. He ended the letter. Rex knows what he's doing, ma'am. I think he learned it from you. I read it twice and filed it in my desk. Then I took it out and read it a third time, slowly, standing at my office window, looking out at the training yard. My mother called on a Tuesday evening in November, and we talked for 45 minutes. Longer than we had talked in years. Without my father in the room, she asked real questions, the kind she calibrated carefully to his register when he was present and saved for the conversations where he wasn't. She asked about Rex. She asked about the kennel, the training program, what it actually felt like to build something from nothing and watch it grow into something that mattered. I told her about Rex's first week, the eagerness, the lessons in stillness, what I had to teach him about the difference between being ready and being in motion. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said simply, "It sounds like you found your thing. No qualifications, no setup. Just that." I said yes, she said. "I've known that for a long time, Maya. I just didn't always say it where he could hear it." I didn't ask her to say more. Some things don't benefit from elaboration. My mother called again in early December and asked if I would come home for Christmas. She had called Danny separately without telling James. She said she was tired of watching her children move apart and that she wanted them in the same house before the year was out, and she said it with the particular quiet firmness she only deployed when she had made up her mind before she picked up the phone. I said yes, not to fix anything, not to resolve anything. I said yes because she asked, and because I love my mother, and because some years you show up for the person who has been in your corner the whole time, even when they didn't have the power to say so out loud. James opened the front door on Christmas Eve. He looked older than I expected. The health scare had taken some weight off him, and the absence of it had changed his face in the way that lost weight changes the face of a man in his 60s. It draws new lines, makes the ones that were already there more legible. He stepped aside and said my name. I said his. We didn't hug. We never do on arrival. I set my bag down next to his old army boots by the door. They have stood in that exact spot since 1995. And walked into my parents' house and let myself simply be there without needing it to be anything else. Claire found me in the kitchen in the late afternoon and said quietly that James had been different since the Florida trip. Quieter, she said. He had watched a documentary about K-9 units 2 nights after we got back. She and Danny hadn't said anything. He'd just had it on in the living room alone. I took that in and nodded. After Claire went back to help Linda, I stood at the kitchen counter for a moment and thought. He watched a documentary, not for me to know about, not to announce or connect to anything said out loud between us. Quietly, privately, on his own terms, trying to learn the shape of something he had always turned past. That was the most James Voss thing I could imagine. And standing there in my mother's kitchen, it meant more to me than I had expected. After dinner, James went to the garage. He always does when the house fills up. Has for as long as I can remember. I followed him. I don't know why exactly. My feet took me there. The garage was cold, machine oil and concrete, and the silence of a space that is used but not lived in. His workbench was clear. The old army footlocker stood open in the corner, and he was sorting through something inside it with the absent motion of a man who needs his hands occupied rather than any particular task to accomplish. He didn't look up when I came in. After a long moment, he said, "Your dog." "Rex," I said. "Yes," he said. "You trained him yourself." I said, "For 18 months before he was paired with his handler." The garage was quiet. The Christmas lights next door flickered on their timer. He said, "And he remembered you. After 3 years," I said. "He did." Another pause, long enough that I thought he was finished. He said very quietly, not intending it to carry but knowing it would, "That's not nothing." 4 words. 4 words in 39 years, in a cold garage on Christmas Eve. I stood in the cold and I thought, this is as close as he knows how to get. This is the vocabulary he has for the thing he is trying to say. And I have to decide, on my own, without his help in the decision, whether that is enough. I can't make that choice for him. I can only make it for myself. Christmas morning, coffee at the kitchen table, the 5 of us moving through the morning with the ease that comes after a hard thing has passed its acute stage and settled into the landscape. James set down his mug and without any preamble asked, "How do you actually train a dog for that kind of work? Where do you start?" He asked it the way he asked things when he had genuinely decided he wanted to know, directly, without softening, with the straightforward expectation of a real answer rather than a polite one. I told him about the breeding programs and early assessment, about the months of basic conditioning before any operational training begins, about teaching a dog that stillness is a form of readiness and not a failure of drive. I told him about the balance between intensity and discipline, about why the handler relationship determines everything and cannot be rushed or manufactured, about what makes a detection dog different from a patrol dog, and what both share underneath those differences. He listened for 20 minutes with his coffee cooling in front of him and his eyes on the table, not performing attention, actually attending. He asked one follow-up question, a specific one about how you know when a dog is ready to be paired. I answered it. He nodded and poured more coffee, and the conversation moved on into the rest of the morning. He didn't say he was proud. He didn't apologize. He asked, and I answered, and in that exchange, ordinary, unheroic, nothing at all like the conversation I had imagined for most of my adult life, something shifted in a way that didn't announce itself. One day you notice a weight is gone, that you had been carrying so long you had stopped feeling it as weight. I drove back to Quantico on Christmas afternoon. The highway was empty, the sky was gray-blue and going dark at 4 o'clock. I thought about the garage and 4 words. I thought about Reyes's letter. I thought about my mother saying I've known that for a long time. And I thought, you don't always get the conversation you needed. Sometimes you get a documentary watched alone in a living room, and 4 words in a cold garage, and a question over coffee that means, if you're paying attention, roughly everything. Sometimes the genuine article is quiet and small and easy to miss if you're still looking for something larger. But I know the difference. I have always known the difference. I just needed to stop requiring someone else to confirm it. The kennel in the 3rd week of December has a particular stillness. 22 dogs settled in their runs, the training cycle between cohorts, the branch at its lowest tempo of the year. Scout, the young Malinois I had been watching since he arrived, the one who reminded me of Rex's first weeks in the way he fought the patience before he found it, had cleared his final certification evaluation. His handler, Corporal Ose, was still luminous with it 3 days later. I watched OC run Scout through a reward drill in the yard and thought about every dog I had ever trained and what the work costs and what it gives back. And I thought about the specific honesty the work requires, the way you cannot perform presence for a working dog, the way the dog always knows whether you are actually there or only going through the motions, and the way that standard, once you have been held to it long enough, makes everything that doesn't meet it feel approximate and hollow. I received an email from Reyes's commanding officer that week. Rex was being formally commended for his performance during a deployment earlier in the year. His CO asked if I would submit a training note for the permanent record, given my role in Rex's early development. I sat at my desk and wrote it. It took 40 minutes. I described the first week, the eagerness, the impatience, the lessons in patience. I wrote about what it meant to teach a dog that readiness is not the same as motion, that the ability to hold still inside uncertainty is not a lesser capacity, but one of the most demanding and necessary ones. I read it back when I was done and thought, simply, that's not just about him. My father called the week before the holiday break. We talked for 12 minutes. He asked about the branch, and I told him about Scout and the cohort and what the next training cycle would look like. He listened. At the end, without preamble, he said, "You're good at what you do, aren't you?" Not a question. He had already decided the answer, and he was stating it, the way he stated the things that had already been settled. I said, "Yes." He said, "Good." 12 minutes. One statement that wasn't a question, not an apology, not the conversation I had been imagining for 30 years, not 39 years of distance closing overnight, just a man who does not say things he doesn't mean, saying a thing he meant. I have been in this work long enough to know the difference between performance and the genuine article. He meant it, and I let it be exactly what it was. Not made smaller by my disappointment that it wasn't more, not made larger by my relief that it was something, just what it was. I stood at the kennel fence on the last evening before the holiday break. The December dark was coming in fast and the branch had gone quiet, and Scout was in his run, watching the yard. He pressed his nose through the wire when he saw me. I put my hand flat against the fence, and he sniffed my fingers and wagged once. Steady, unhurried, with the easy confidence of a dog who has done the work and knows it. I thought about Rex at the airport, pressing his muzzle into my palm without ceremony, without announcement. I thought about my father in the cold garage in 4 words. I thought about 18 months of daily honest work that left something in a dog that 3 years could not overwrite. And I thought, you don't get into this work for recognition. The dogs can't give you a medal or tell anyone what you built. What they give you is something that doesn't have a name, a kind of honesty, a relationship that only holds if you are actually, consistently, truly present. Not performing presence. Actually there. I have never been able to fake my way through it. The dogs always know. And standing there at the fence in the December cold, with Scout's nose warm against my fingers, and the last of the lights going off behind me, I was glad of that. Glad of the standard. Glad of the work. Glad that somewhere inside the work, quietly and without anyone needing to watch, I had become exactly the person I was always going to become, and that I had finally stopped waiting for someone else to confirm it. Some people find out who they are in a room full of witnesses. I found out in a kennel on a Tuesday with a dog who didn't care what my father thought. He only asked that I show up and be honest. Those have turned out to be the best metrics I've found in 39 years. The only ones, really, that don't eventually let you down. Expansion passages to be woven into the script in editing. The VMI years were 4 of the best and hardest of my life. The first year, what the school called the rat line, was designed to strip you down to what you actually were. Not what you had been told you were. Not what you performed in front of people who already had opinions about you. But what was actually there when the performance was no longer possible, because you were too exhausted to maintain it. I got up at 5:30 every morning for 9 months. I ran before breakfast, and as I was inspected before I could enter rooms. I was addressed in a particular way that marked me as the lowest category of person in the building until I had proven otherwise. And in that proving, I found something I had been looking for since I was 8 years old at the dinner table. A framework that measured me against a standard rather than against my father's expectations. Those are not the same standard. They look similar from the outside, but they are entirely different things. One is specific and earned and requires your actual best effort. The other is whatever the person setting it decides to see on any given morning. I graduated VMI knowing what I was. I didn't fully understand that yet. It took years for the knowledge to consolidate into certainty. But the seed of it was planted there, in the rat line, in the cold mornings on the parade ground, in the evaluations where the results were the results and not the product of someone's prior judgment. I received my commission in May of 2008 and drove home from Quantico alone that evening, knowing something I didn't yet have language for. That the measure my father used was not the only one available, and that the other ones, the ones built on observable, consistent performance, had been measuring me for 4 years and had returned a different verdict than the one I had been living inside. The years between Quantico and Afghanistan also taught me things that don't get noted in performance reports. I learned how to exist in an institution that had its own gravity and its own rhythms, and that did not organize itself around my private history. I learned that being good at a job and being seen as good at a job are related but not identical. That visibility is a skill separate from competence, and that I had more of the second than the first at the start. I learned how to ask for things I needed without framing them as requests, and how to give feedback in a way that the person receiving it could actually hear. I learned the difference between commanding and leading, that commanding is formal and backed by rank, and leading is personal and backed by trust, and that you need both and they require different muscles. These are not things you can be taught. You learn them by doing them wrong first and paying attention to what went wrong. Afghanistan confirmed things I had suspected and taught me things I could not have anticipated. I had known I was good under pressure in controlled environments. The rat line, the training exercises, the evaluations where the difficulty was structured and bounded. Afghanistan was different. The difficulty there was not structured. It arrived without warning and in forms that the planning documents had not anticipated, and the skill it required was not the skill of being prepared, but the skill of being present, of seeing what was actually in front of you and responding to that, rather than to the scenario you had rehearsed. I found out that I was good at that, better than I had known, and finding that out in a place where the stakes were real and the results were permanent taught me something about confidence that no amount of performance review could have replicated. The knowledge I brought home from Afghanistan was quiet and personal, and not the kind you put in a report. It was simply the knowledge that under genuinely difficult conditions I had been genuinely useful, and that this had nothing to do with my father's approval of my career path. They existed in completely separate spaces. They had always existed in completely separate spaces. I was beginning, slowly and incompletely, to understand that. In the months after I returned from Lackland and began working at Quantico in earnest, I started to understand what the work with military working dogs was actually teaching me about my own life. The dogs had no patience for anything except what was real. A dog cannot be managed or placated. You cannot tell a dog that you are present when you are not, cannot perform attentiveness for a dog the way you can for a person who is willing to accept the performance. The dog always knows, and knowing that the dog always knew meant that I had to actually be there, not performing being there, not going through the motions while my attention was elsewhere, but genuinely present in each session, each repetition, each correction, and reward. That quality of attention was what the work demanded, and meeting that demand day after day changed something in me in a way I am still not fully able to articulate. It made the performances feel thin. It made me impatient with the version of myself that had been sending milestone emails to my father and waiting for a response that would tell me whether the work was worth doing. The dogs had been telling me the work was worth doing every single day. I just hadn't been listening to the right source. There was a dinner in 2023, Danny's birthday, a restaurant in McLean, where the conversation turned briefly to my work. My brother-in-law, who worked for a defense contractor and knew what military working dog programs cost and what they produced, said something precise and informed about the strategic value of the certification work my branch had been doing. My father listened to this with the particular quality of attention he gave to things that arrived from an unexpected direction. Not warmed exactly, but paused. For about 90 seconds, the conversation was about my work, and my father was paying attention to it, rather than waiting for his turn. Then he redirected the conversation to a former unit brother who had recently started a consulting firm, and the 90 seconds passed. But I noticed them. I filed them. I am not sure what I thought I would do with them eventually. I think I was still at that point collecting evidence for a case I had not yet decided to stop making. The hotel beach in Florida that October night was the quietest I had been in a long time. Not peaceful exactly. There was too much unsettled in me for peace. But quiet in the way that comes after a thing has been named and cannot be unnamed. My father had laughed. Not because he was trying to harm me, not from cruelty, but from the simple and complete absence of the understanding that what he was laughing at was something I had spent 17 years building. The laugh was not personal. That was almost the most painful part. I was not a person to him in those moments. I was a category, a daughter who had chosen a soft branch of a soft service, who was being told by a dog handler to move, and wasn't that just how things worked out? The laugh came from a man who loved me. That's the thing you have to sit with. eventually. The fact that love and understanding are not the same thing, and that a person can have a great deal of the first and almost none of the second, and that you cannot argue them into a different amount of the second, no matter how much evidence you provide. Rex had known me. After 3 years of separation, after 3 years of new handlers and new assignments and new contexts, Rex had known me in the time it took to cross a room. Because I had been honest with him for 18 months. Because I had shown up every day and done the work and been present in the way the work demanded. Because whatever I had put into those 18 months had left something in him that was prior to all the subsequent experience, a foundation underneath all the other foundations. I thought about that on the beach, with the gulf going dark in front of me, and I thought, that is the thing I want, not the salute, not the recognition in front of strangers at an airport. The thing underneath the salute. The kind of mark you leave on something when you have been genuinely present with it over a long period of time. The kind of mark that does not require announcement because it announces itself when the moment comes in a way that nobody in the room can misread. I walked back to the hotel when the sand got too cold. I washed my face and sat on the edge of the bed and called Diane and talked for an hour. And when I hung up, I felt something that was not resolution, but was close to the precondition of it. The sense of having understood a thing correctly, finally, after a long time of understanding it wrong. The last week of November, I ran my usual loop around the base roads in the dark. 4 miles, the same route I had been running since I arrived at Quantico. The same sequence of turns and grades that I could navigate now without any conscious thought, which meant the running was available for whatever the mind needed to do with it. I thought about the branch. The current cohort was performing well. 2 dogs in particular were tracking ahead of projection, and my lead trainer, Gunnery Sergeant Hollis, had identified a methodological adjustment in the early detection work that I wanted to review before implementing. I thought about Scout and the quality of attention he had shown in his final evaluations. That easy and earned confidence, that is the goal of everything we do. And I thought about my father watching a canine documentary alone in his living room 2 nights after we got back from Florida. Not for anyone, just for himself, trying to understand something. That image kept returning to me in those weeks. My father at 65, retired, with his opinions settled and his framework long since built, sitting alone with a documentary about the thing his daughter did, trying to place it inside the world he understood. I didn't know what the documentary showed him. I didn't know if it moved anything. I only knew that he had chosen to watch it, privately, without announcing it. And that act, small and private and easily missed, was more legible to me by November than any of the 20 years of redirected conversations had been. It was the grammar of a man trying to say something he didn't have words for. I was learning to read it. First Lieutenant Brooks stopped me in the corridor one afternoon near the end of November. She had news. Her father had come to her promotion ceremony, had stayed the whole time, had shaken hands with her commanding officer, and said he was proud. He hadn't understood what she did, but he had shown up. She was still visibly surprised by it, still running the event through her mind, trying to make sense of it. I said, "Sometimes that's the whole thing." She said, "Is it enough?" I said after a moment, "It's a start." She laughed, a little uncertainly, and went back to work. I stood in the corridor for a moment after she left and thought about what I had just said, and whether I believed it. I decided I did. A start is not nothing. A start is the precondition of everything else. That morning at the airport wasn't the ending I had been waiting for. It wasn't the conversation my father and I never quite managed to have, and it wasn't the apology I had half expected and half stopped wanting. It was a dog who remembered me. And somehow, that turned out to be exactly enough. If you've ever had someone in your life who loved you genuinely but couldn't quite find the language for what you'd built, I'd love to know how you navigated that. Did something small finally shift things? Was there a moment, or did it just slowly become quieter? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one, and I mean that. And if you're not subscribed yet, hit subscribe and the bell.